James and his daughter Lily had always shared a simple life in their small rural house, far from the bustle of city life. After his wife's tragic death in a car accident a year ago, James had focused solely on raising Lily. She had been his world, his reason for waking up every day. Their home, an old two-story farmhouse surrounded by acres of wild, untamed garden, was the perfect refuge from the pain they'd both endured. At first, Lily had been her usual playful self, full of life and curiosity. They spent their days together, working in the garden, baking, reading stories, and enjoying the peace of their quiet life. James had noticed a few subtle changes after his wife's passing, but nothing that raised alarms. Lily was still the same affectionate child, though occasionally she seemed to be distracted, her thoughts wandering off into spaces James couldn't quite understand. But it was easy to brush it off, attributing her odd moments to grief or loneliness. Still, in the back of his mind there was a nagging feeling, a sense that things weren't as they seemed. However, the first sign that something was wrong came on one cold night in early autumn, just a few weeks after their new normal had settled into place. Lily had been restless in bed, tossing and turning, as though something was keeping her awake. She had a habit of talking in her sleep sometimes, but this night her murmurs were different. They were too deliberate, too strange, too far out of the ordinary to be dismissed. Lily had started saying things like, "It won't stop? They're watching me," her voice low and almost hypnotic. James had tried to comfort her, brushing it off as bad dreams, but deep down, his instincts told him something was wrong. He decided to keep a closer eye on her that night. It was one of those quiet, crisp nights when James was woken by the sound of soft footsteps. He assumed it was just Lily coming to him for comfort, but when he checked her room, he found her bed empty. Panic set in. He rushed downstairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The house was eerily still, too still. He called out for her, but there was no response. It wasn't until he stepped outside into the cold garden that he found her. Lily was sitting in the center of the garden, her small form still as a statue. The moonlight cast an ethereal glow on her pale face. She was staring at nothing, her eyes wide and unblinking, a faint, unnatural smile curling on her lips. She didn't respond when he called her name. He tried to coax her back inside, but she didn't move. It was as though she were lost in a trance, disconnected from reality. When he finally managed to pull her back inside, she didn't say a word. She simply went back to bed as though nothing had happened. James stayed up that night, watching over her, unsure of what to make of the incident. Was it a sleepwalking episode, or something far darker? He didn't know, but the unease lingered in the pit of his stomach. The next day, Lily seemed perfectly normal, just as she always had been. She smiled and laughed like a carefree child. But James couldn't shake the image of her sitting in the garden, her expression so vacant, so distant. Over the next few weeks, James noticed that Lily's behavior became more erratic, especially at night. She would often leave her room after dark, wandering aimlessly around the house, sometimes playing with objects in strange, disjointed ways. He'd find her in the most peculiar positions, sitting on the floor in the hallway, staring at the walls with an unnerving intensity. There were nights when she would crawl around the house on her hands and knees, laughing in a high-pitched, unsettling tone. When James would approach her, she would stop immediately and stare at him, her eyes wide and unblinking. Sometimes, she would speak in a voice that didn't sound like hers, as if someone else were controlling her every word. "Come play with me, Daddy," she would whisper, her voice dripping with an eerie calmness. James tried everything to get her to sleep in her bed and stay there, but it was futile. She would wake up in the middle of the night and quietly leave her room. He began locking her bedroom door at night, But it didn't stop her. He found that no matter how securely he locked the door, it would always be unlocked in the morning. One night he installed a baby monitor in her room, hoping to catch her in the act and prevent further incidents. But the next morning, when he listened to the audio recording, it chilled him to the bone. The monitor had recorded her speaking in a strange guttural language, something he couldn't understand. As he sat there, his blood ran cold. His daughter was no longer his little girl. Someone, or something, had taken control of her. James decided to visit the garden the next morning to see if there was anything unusual about it. As he stepped out into the garden, he felt a chill in the air that wasn't normal for that time of year. The plants, usually vibrant and healthy, seemed to have withered, their colors dull and lifeless. The once beautiful roses that Lily had loved to tend to now appeared brown and dead. It was as if the garden itself had been drained of life. James walked around the yard, examining every corner, but there was no sign of Lily's presence from the previous night. He couldn't explain why, but something about the place felt sinister, as if the garden itself had been touched by something dark. He looked back at the house, then at the garden again, and for the first time since his wife's death, he felt a growing sense of dread. It wasn't just Lily's strange behavior. There was something about the house, the land, the very air that felt wrong. And every time Lily ventured into the garden at night, it seemed to come alive with a twisted energy that James couldn't understand. As the weeks passed, Lily's behavior grew more erratic. She began to have vivid, disturbing dreams she would recount to James in great detail the next morning. She spoke of dark figures watching her, of voices calling her into the woods behind their house. She described seeing strange creatures that weren't human, their faces distorted in horrifying ways. Lily's once innocent dreams had turned into something dark and terrifying. One morning she woke up in tears, her face pale and drawn. She told James that the creatures in her dreams were real, and that they had been visiting her at night. She said they had told her to come with them, that they were waiting for her in the garden. James tried to comfort her, brushing off her stories as mere nightmares. But deep down, he knew there was something more to it. Lily wasn't just dreaming. She was being haunted. Whatever was controlling her wasn't a figment of her imagination, it was real, and it had a grip on her, pulling her further away from him with each passing day. As the days went on, James noticed a chilling change in Lily's personality. She became distant, her once sweet demeanor replaced by an unsettling coldness. She no longer smiled or laughed. She would sit in the garden for hours, staring at nothing, her expression vacant and lifeless. When James would try to talk to her, she would simply turn away and ignore him, as if he were invisible. There were moments when he would reach out to her, trying to make some connection, but it felt as though she were no longer there. Her eyes would look at him, but they were empty. Her soul had been replaced with something else, something that wasn't his daughter. Lily began to refuse food, often staring at her plate without touching it. The once active and curious child, who had loved playing outside, had become a hollow shell, consumed by something far darker. James would hear her whispering to herself in the garden at night, her words strange and unintelligible. When he would approach, she would stop and stare at him with a chilling gaze before retreating further into the darkness. Desperate for answers, James began researching everything he could about possession and hauntings. He scoured old books, visited local libraries, and spoke to anyone who might have knowledge of the supernatural. It was then that he stumbled across a disturbing legend, the story of an ancient curse that had been placed upon the land centuries ago. According to the legend, the garden behind his house was once the site of dark rituals, where spirits were summoned and bound to the land. It was said that the spirits would take control of anyone who lived on the property, slowly drawing them into a state of madness and possession. The more James read, the more he realized that his daughter wasn't just suffering from a psychological disorder. She was being controlled by something far more sinister. The garden was the key. Whatever dark force resided there was feeding off her soul, pulling her deeper into its grip. James knew he had to act fast. He couldn't lose Lily to whatever malevolent force was destroying her from the inside out. One fateful night, James woke to the sound of strange chanting in the air. He rushed to Lily's room, but once again, she was gone. As he made his way through the house, he could feel a heavy, oppressive energy in the air. He entered the garden, his heart pounding with fear. There, he found Lily standing in the center of the garden, her head tilted back and her arms outstretched. She was no longer the little girl he knew. Her eyes were pitch black, her face twisted in a grotesque, unnatural expression. She was speaking in a language James couldn't understand, her voice a deep guttural growl. Lily's body jerked and convulsed as though it were being controlled by an unseen force. The garden seemed to pulse with dark energy, and James could feel the weight of something ancient and malevolent surrounding him. He tried to call out to her, but the words stuck in his throat. His daughter was gone, replaced by something far more terrifying. The entity that had taken control of her was now fully unleashed, and there was no telling what it would do next. James couldn't stand by and watch his daughter suffer any longer. He began to search for ways to rid the house of the evil presence that had claimed Lily. He found an old priest who agreed to help, though the priest was hesitant. The ritual would be dangerous, and it wasn't guaranteed to work. James didn't care. He would do anything to save his daughter. Together, they performed the ritual, chanting prayers and drawing symbols of protection around the house. As they began, Lily's cries grew louder, her body writhing in agony. The entity inside her fought back, its power almost overwhelming. But James refused to give up. He held onto his love for Lily, his hope that she could be saved. The ritual reached its climax, and for a moment everything went silent. James waited, holding his breath, unsure if the ritual had worked or if the entity had claimed his daughter forever. After the ritual, things seemed to calm down for a few days. Lily seemed to be back to her old self, and James allowed himself to hope. But the peace didn't last. One night, he woke to find Lily gone again. This time, when he found her in the garden, she was no longer alone. Dark shadows circled around her, and the air was thick with malevolent energy. The entity that had possessed her was furious, its power more dangerous than ever. It spoke to James in a voice that wasn't Lily's, warning him that the ritual had only delayed the inevitable. The entity had no intention of leaving. It had already taken hold of Lily's soul, and now it would destroy everything in its path. James knew there was no more time. He had to act quickly, or he would lose Lily forever. In a final act of desperation, James made the ultimate sacrifice. He was willing to give up his own life to save Lily from the malevolent entity that had taken over her. He invoked a forbidden ritual he had found in his research, a ritual that could sever the bond between Lily and the entity, but only if he were willing to pay the price. James stepped into the garden one last time, preparing himself for the most difficult decision of his life. He had no idea if it would work, but he had to try. He held Lily in his arms, whispering words of love and hope into her ear, praying that the bond between them would be enough to break the curse. The ritual reached its climax, and the garden seemed to come alive with darkness. James's body began to burn, his soul torn between this world and the next. But in the end, the entity was forced to leave, its hold on Lily broken. The next morning, James awoke in his bed. The garden was peaceful, the sun shining through the windows, but Lily was gone. The ritual had worked, but it had come at a great cost. James searched the house, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had never existed. The darkness that had consumed their home was gone, but so was the light. James was left alone, haunted by the memory of his daughter, and though the evil had been vanquished, the pain of loss lingered in the air as though it had left an indelible mark on everything it had touched. Years later, the house stood abandoned. James never returned. The garden remained wild and untamed, the plants growing back in vibrant colors. But something still lingered in the air, an unsettling presence that had never truly left. It was said that sometimes, late at night, you could hear the soft laughter of a child, followed by the sound of footsteps in the garden, walking, playing, or maybe just waiting. No one could say for sure. But one thing was certain: the garden and the darkness it held would never truly be free.